Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, students. It is my privilege and great honor to welcome Professor Robert Shiller at Vilnius University Life Science Center. Professor Shiller is Sterling Professor of Economics, Department of Economics and Coase Foundation for Research in Economics at Yale University. I will remind that Sterling Professor is the highest academic rank at Yale. Robert Shiller is also Professor of Finance and Fellow at the International Center for Finance at Yale School of Management. He received his BA from the University of Michigan in 1967 and his PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1972. He has written numerous academic works, books on financial markets, behavioral economics, macroeconomics, real estate, statistical methods, and on public attitudes, opinions, and moral judgments regarding markets. The professional economists definitely know books written by Professor Shiller, but I would say that even general public is familiar very well with books like Irrational Exuberance, which describes markets and how markets can hurt and bubble and explode. Professor Shiller, together with colleagues, founded several companies that develop market indices, and these indices are used by traders and investors at the New York Stock Exchange and Chicago Mercantile Exchange. He has been research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research since 1980. He served as vice president of the American Economic Association 2005, and he was elected president of the American Economic Association in 2016. And we all know that he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences jointly with Eugene Fama and Lars Peter Hansen 4 years ago in 2013. And of course, general public knows very well Professor Shiller from his numerous public appearances on the US national TV and radio shows and from his regular columns at the New York Times and the Project Syndicate pages. Today we have an exceptional and exciting opportunity to have Robert Shiller at Vilnius University, and I kindly ask Professor Shiller to deliver us a lecture. The title you see on the light board. Thank you. And please take a stand.
This goes on your head, like this, behind you.
All right, that's working, I can tell. Thank you. So I'm very happy to be here at Vilnius University and also in Lithuania, which feels like home to me in a way. My ancestors came from here 100 years ago to the United States. But I was close to my grandmothers. I heard many stories about Lithuania. Since then, I have turned into a regular American, except I brought my whole family here, but much of my family, after I won the Nobel Prize. We all came to Lithuania after I brought my brother, my cousin, my two sons, their wives, my cousin's wife, and we had a great time here. So it's nice to be back. I'm going to talk today. I have a title for my talk which has two topics: narrative economics and neuroeconomics, and they maybe require some explanation. The term narrative economics has not been popular. I found it used in 1895 in a textbook, meaning narrative economics is the study of economic history by repeating stories of what happened in the past. But for me, it has a different meaning, which I'll give to you and develop. This was the title of my presidential address before the American Economic Association, and it represents a different emphasis in economics, emphasizing narratives or the stories that people tell as a source of economic change. I'm going to relate it also to epidemiology, to the spread of ideas like viruses, thinking that much of change in economics is due to something going viral, some idea going viral, and infecting the minds of people. So this is what I'll be explaining. It's my hope for the future. It's also my idea that something that will happen without me, or even if I hadn't said anything like this, it's a trend. It's related also to big data, to the availability of data in much more detail, individual detail. And it's related to the development of search technology and methods of analyzing textual information. So this is my prediction for the future of economics. I think some things will be different. Now, I also added neuroeconomics to the title. This happened, well, it's because I believe that economists have to try to reach a little into other approaches than, I think that academia, not just in economics department, but in any department, tends to find it difficult to take on new paradigms and new ways of thinking. They tend to get stuck in a trajectory. I'm particularly aware of neuroeconomics because I was invited to give keynote speeches, first at the Society for Neuroscience, and then just this year before the Society for Neuroeconomics. I told them I don't know, I'm not an expert on neuroeconomics, but I decided that maybe I am because they asked me to speak to their group. But I was impressed that neuroeconomics is a new developing field that is kind of separate from economics departments. So most of the people at the meeting for the Society of Neuroeconomics, which was in Canada this year, it moves around, most of them were from medical schools or other outside places. So I think it's something I should do, is to try to promote what I think are important and interesting ideas. So I didn't get a clicker. I don't see it here. How do I advance this? Well, I will keep talking while you figure out how to advance my slides.
Right here. Just click on the mouse with the mouse.
Or just click on the right click.
On left.
Okay. So I've kind of already, there's a history going back a couple hundred years of interest in contagion of ideas. The term was first described by David Hume in the mid-1700s. He thought that ideas spread like diseases. The idea of idea microbes was raised in the late 19th century when they discovered microbes, and they thought that ideas are like microbes, they spread. They didn't call them viruses until after 1895, when viruses were first discovered. Richard Dawkins called them memes. He coined a word in the English language. But I think we also have to think that our society is driven by changes in narratives that form a kind of constellation of narratives. My discussion, neuroscience is such a vast, vast field. It's stunning how many smart people there are working in the area. I'm only going to relate to certain research that relates to the idea of epidemics in economics. So I'm kind of finding myself late in my career leaning toward the medical school, which seems odd. I never would have dreamed that an economist would start listening to them. But the medical school has an epidemiology department that studies transmission of diseases. I'm going to learn from them. And they also have a department of neuroscience, as I was saying, but also departments of, I was thinking of endocrinology, where they study hormones, but there's starting to be a literature on the effects of testosterone on economic behavior and on oxytocin and economic behavior. I'm not going to get into that. There's also people now doing studies of genetics. People's genes affect their economic behavior. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to just stay in the epidemiology department and the neuroscience department here. There's too much here. But, so, here's my latest book, Kvalius Vejona, which is now in Lithuanian translation. It was written jointly with George Akerlof, but the subtitle is Manipulation and the Economics of Manipulation and Deception. So it's substantially about narratives. But it also emphasizes another component, that a lot of change, economic change that we see, is caused by deliberately placed narratives. People these days really want to go viral. They want their ideas to spread on the internet. But it isn't just recently that people have wanted to go viral. They did it 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, without the internet. There were other modes of communication that mattered. So I was wondering about the word narrative in English, and it is translated into Lithuanian as pasakojimas. I said that right. I'm not sure what the translation means, but the word narrative to me in English refers, it's not the same thing as story. It's almost the same thing. But a narrative is a certain telling of a story that gives it virality, may give it virality. The story tries to be contagious. And so there are certain choices that the narrator makes to make the story lively and contagious. So I'm emphasizing a narrative is a story that has a certain liveliness that will make it repeated. It will be viral, it may go viral. But it also has a certain element of explanation or interpretation of things that happen to us in life, or things that we can make it happen. It's related to the term animal spirits, I think. The title of another book that I have with Akerlof. It goes back at least 2,000 years. The ancient Latin expression spiritus animalis refers to animating spirit. What is it that drives people to action or to innovate or do something different? That's what I'm relating to narratives. So I just wanted to give you one example of well, let me start with the left-hand part of this slide. So outside of economics, there has been an increasing attention to narrative as a force in human behavior. So much so that a number of authors have proposed that we rename our human species from Homo sapiens to, well, it depends on what Latin you use. Homo narrans, Homo narrator, or Homo narrativus. Human beings all over the world tell stories. Anthropologists like to summarize human universals. Every society tells stories, no exception. Go to observe a primitive remote tribe and look at them, you'll see them standing facing each other a short distance apart and talking. And what are they talking about? They're telling jokes or stories. They're eager to tell a story that excites their imagination. Stories have emotional component and generally a time sequence, and then some moral. There's a moral of the story, or it may be a story at somebody else's expense, establishing a sense of community for us. So I just have this picture. I was just introspecting. I was watching Stravinsky's Firebird ballet on the web. And there was this one scene. I don't have to tell you the whole story, but the men in this village had all been defeated and frozen by magic into stone. And at the end, they somehow prevail, and they return as heroes. And this is the picture from the ballet of them being greeted by their women. And I found myself playing that same scene over, and I was wondering, what is it that I like about that? What is it? I think I'm not a particularly warlike person or interested in military, but somehow the story of returning heroes being greeted by their lovely women was, maybe it's a primordial image like Carl Jung that we all, or most of us, share. And so stories re-engineer these primitive archetypes. So I'm going to give another example of a narrative, which I think you probably have heard of. So this is the narrative from the narrative of robots. I think this is the narrative of our time right now, because I'll argue that. The idea that you are worried what's going to happen to you because robots or other artificial intelligence is taking over the world. This narrative might inhibit your spending money. You want to save more because you don't have confidence in your own future. It might encourage you to tolerate high asset prices and buy them anyway because you feel that you're not secure and you need to own something. This narrative has spread over the entire world. So it looks like it started in 1920 with a Czech play by Karel Čapek that coined the word robot. The story was that Mr. Rossum built a robot factory and was producing robots and selling them. But then the robots eventually got nasty and formed themselves into an army and conquered the human race. But that story didn't really catch on until much later. So what I'm showing in the diagram is a Google Ngram search for the word robot in books. And you can see that there was an unusual spike in attention to robots around the late 1970s and early 80s. Why? That's what I think it's economically active, these stories, because of their implications for our future. Well, it was in 1977 that the first Zwijgzu Karai movie came out, and it had a subtitle, and I'll say it. See, Senai Senai Talamoye Galacticoye. You've heard that. Why is that important? See, these people were geniuses. This was among the most highest grossing movies of all time, and it led off a series of movies. And why that subtitle? Was that brilliant? Because it made it something to take over the whole world. It was it said long, long ago in a distant galaxy. That means it's not American, okay? It's not any one ethnic group. So it could expand over the whole planet, which is what it did. Now there are other terms related to the fear of robots. I have on there artificial intelligence, labor-saving machinery, and technological unemployment. This data cuts off in 2008. I'll show you more modern data in a minute. But there were other names for the same story of robots. So I took two of the less frequent ones that were shown in the previous chart: labor-saving machinery and technological unemployment. They had different courses, but they were rising. The labor-saving machinery was a term that occupied a lot of people's attention through much of the 19th century. That was because they were developing machinery that was replacing mainly agricultural harvesting or other machinery. And there was the same fear that we talk about today, that you'll lose your job, or you won't have any work. In the 1930s, in the Great Depression, the new term appeared, technological unemployment. It's the same thing. You see that these different, do you understand what I'm giving? These are counts of the percent of words in books, according to Google Ngrams, that use the phrase. And so the frequency was rising of labor-saving machinery was rising until around 1940, and then been declining ever since. Well, not until just recently. Very recently, I'm using now Google Trends, which is a word which counts phrases in web searches. So we're looking at what people were searching. Now this doesn't say robots or labor-saving machinery. It says something it says universal basic income. There has been an explosion of web searches in the last year about universal basic income. So I think we have another epidemic here that is starting. Now I link that to robots. Why would you be concerned about a universal basic income is a proposal which was made first about 70 years ago, but has suddenly become viral again. A proposal that every person should have an automatic guaranteed income, maybe at a low level, but livable income from the government. Why is it being talked about now? I think it's because the robot narrative is coming back again. It's like a new round of an influenza epidemic, but the epidemic is fear of automation replacing jobs. So this matters for economics, but it's not considered mainstream by economists. So here is another database, it's called JSTOR, and it tabulates scholarly journals, and it also allows you to search by field. So what I did is I picked the major social sciences, and I asked it to search for the term narrative, and this gives the percent of scholarly articles that have the word narrative in each of these fields. I did it twice, first for all dates, and secondly for the years since between 2010 and 2016. This slide appeared in my presidential address. And you can see that economics and finance use the term the least. You can also see that every single social science is using narrative more than they were since 2010. Even economics. There has been, I think, a switch toward understanding the importance of narratives. Certain thought leaders were important. Mainly, what comes to mind first is the psychologist Jerome Bruner, who advocated studying narratives. Well, he wrote very nice articles about the importance of narrative in people's thinking. For example, every person has a personal story, which they will probably tell you if you draw them out, explaining why I am an important, good person, and defining who I am. I'm defined by a story. You can't forget the story because then you're just a random person and it's meaningless. We get meaning. Stories have morals and meaning. In your personal story, the moral is usually, I'm a good person that people ought to pay attention to. But see, as I was saying at the beginning, we're able more now to study narratives. It used to be that you couldn't. It was prohibitively costly. But with big data, now this is a chart that I got from ProQuest News and Newspapers, another digitized database. And I did it as a percent of articles that have either the term neuroscience or big data in it. You can see that since 2000, there has been a big change. Neuroscience is getting much more important, and so is big data. So these two trends, I think, can't miss being a major influence in economics. We don't have to just rely on GDP statistics and interest rate data. There's so much else data that we can start analyzing and trying to appreciate. This is a plot of the United States unemployment rate, the percent of the labor force unemployed since 1890. And I'm just putting this up to inquire, to just raise to you what is the prime question in modern macroeconomics, is why does it fluctuate like that? If you look at these data, it looks different than a lot of other data series you've seen. Notably, it's very spiky, right? There are these high unemployment periods that drop away. There are also some prominent spikes. The most prominent one that you will see was the Great Depression of the 1930s. Well, it started with the stock market crash of 1929 and led to the Great Depression, where unemployment almost hit 25%. And it stayed up for a decade until World War II ended it. It's an unfortunate ending to the Depression because the Depression was even worse in Germany. And there's a widespread feeling that Adolf Hitler got elected because of the Depression. People were so angry and upset, they voted for the Nazi Party. There's analyses that seem to give strong suggestion to that. The other thing is, there was another depression in the 1890s, which you can see up there. But that depression, you probably never heard of it. So that's because it dropped out of the narrative. The Great Depression remains because that narrative has stayed contagious. So this is like typhoid fever. If we think of narratives as diseases, it's gone. We don't hear about it anymore. So this is the stock market as I've plotted it from 1870. This is on my website. I keep updating this. The blue is real inflation-corrected stock prices in the United States. And the green is the corporate earnings per share on the same stocks. And you can see that they go through hump-shaped patterns like the other narratives we've seen. So you wonder, are they somehow connected to narratives? I'm saying wonder because I don't have solid proof. You can look, by the way, oh, do I have this I can point? Just discover, you see that. That's where we are in the stock market right now. It has done amazing changes in value between 2009 and now. Why? Well, you might say earnings went up. But no, they really didn't. It was just that 2009 earnings were extremely bad. Earnings haven't gone up that much in real terms, but the stock market has gone up. So why? You might say, well, interest rates are down. But then why are interest rates down? These are big unknowns. The economic profession doesn't answer questions like this with any authority. And I'm thinking that the question has to do, it's partly a methodological problem that we won't discuss our changing narrative as economists, because it's not our department. So I said that the Great Depression, I assume you've heard of the Great Depression, right? Most of you here. It's actually a legend that has been growing ever since the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, they didn't know about the Great Depression. It wasn't, well, you can see, I have both engrams in the thin line counts, and I have ProQuest, news and newspapers count. One's books, one's in news and newspaper. But again, Ngrams ends in 2008. But you can see there's been an uptrend in talk about the Great Depression ever since the Great Depression. It's just been a growing pattern. And then it reached astronomical proportions during the 2009 crisis. I think that it reached such proportions that's connected with what happened. It was, again, fear of that story. We have lots of stories. There's a constellation of narratives about the Great Depression, even though we have no stories about the 1890. You never hear anybody saying, could this be 1893 again? It's just lost. It's lost from our collective memory. Now, some people will say that these stories you don't have any proof that these stories affect economic behavior. How do you know that causality isn't reversed, that depressions create stories and the stories don't affect what people do? The problem in economics is you can't run controlled experiments. I could say, let's try an experiment. When I go to the Bank of Lithuania, I say, let's see if we can crash the Lithuanian economy as an experiment. Well, nobody ever does that. It might be useful for scientific knowledge to try to do that, but we're not going to do that. But in other fields, they do controlled experiments in marketing, journalism, education, health interventions, philanthropy, and law. Let me give one example, the last example. This article by Bell et al. In 1985. They did experiments with juries, mock trials. There was really no real person, but they had being tried. But they had lawyers present cases in front of students who were pretending to be juries. And what the experiment they did is they asked the prosecuting lawyer to give a bland story, or with one group, the control group, or a vivid story with the experimental group, and use the same story. But in the vivid story, you just throw in all kinds of colorful details about. So, for example, in one case, the lawyer with the bland story said, describing what the accused was accused of doing, that he lunged at the victim and hurt the victim. I just said that in a bland way. The juiced up way was to say, the accused lunged across the table and knocked a bowl of green guacamole dip onto the white shag rug and attacked the victim. Now, that guacamole dip falling on the white shag rug has no relevance to the case, but it made people remember the story, and the convictions were higher. Sad state of but reality. Now, what I'm getting at here is that contagion is invented by storytellers, and they have difficulty being successful. It's difficult to set off an epidemic, to go viral. But once it starts, if you have the contagion rate high enough, you get an epidemic. So I'm using here the Kermack-McKendrick SIR model of disease epidemics, which was published 90 years ago. And it led to a whole field of mathematical epidemiology. There are many, many variants on this model, but I'm just sticking with their initial model. The model has three kinds of people: susceptibles who haven't. Now, we're talking medical school here. This is just medical. If you can transplant for a moment, we're talking about a disease. You have susceptibles who haven't caught the disease. You have infectives who have caught it and are spreading it. They're contagious. And then you have recovereds who, in this model, are permanently immune and won't spread the disease. And it's very simple. The parameter C is the contagion rate and R is the recovery rate. But it merely says that the number of new infectious cases is determined by the product of S times I, because times the contagion rate C. That S times I reflects the number of possible people meeting each other in a pair of a susceptible and an infected. At that point, there's a probability of it becoming transmitted. And then also the infected people overcome their infection at a rate R. So it turns out, well, I'll just show you what an example. Well, yeah, I'm not going to go through this math. But it turns out that the epidemic model implies that epidemic will take a hump-shaped pattern, even if the contagion rate and recovery rate are constant through time. It starts when somehow the illness is introduced to a society, and then it grows if the number of new contagious cases is greater than the recovery, if they're spreading faster than recovery. And you see the up part of the thing. But then when the number of susceptibles has gone down because they've caught the disease, it doesn't matter if two infected people meet each other, they're already infected. You have to have a susceptible meeting and infect. Eventually there aren't enough susceptible infective pairings to overcome the recovery rate, and the epidemic fades. The critical thing to understand is that size of the epidemic, the percent of the population eventually infected, depends on C over R, but the speed of the epidemic depends on the level. So you can have fast epidemics and slow epidemics. You can have epidemics that take 100 years to complete, or just a month or a week to complete, if it depends on how high the contagion rate. And you can have epidemics that infect everybody, everyone's had it, almost everyone. Or you can have epidemics that come and go, and only 5% of the population. So the time frame and the scale is variable by those parameters. So this is this is a case where the N equals 100 people, we introduce one infected person, and I've chosen those parameter values. And the critical thing is that heavy line, which maps the number of infected carrying people. And it has this hump-shaped curve. We've already seen that in some of our examples that I've shown you. I didn't prove that it's a contagion model. There are other models. But here's some more example. This is kind of depressing to think about this, but a person is a sort of idea or a certain identity. And if they become famous, what does the word famous mean? It means you've gone viral, right? That everyone's talking about. There's a contagion of your persona somehow. Well, these things follow the Kermack-McKendrick model fairly well. They're all hump-shaped. All of these are all famous American writers, or English. Mark Twain, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Jane Austen, Washington Irving. You've never heard of Washington Irving. That's because that was an earlier epidemic, and it's practically gone now. Here's Russian composers. I didn't discover this. There was a science article by Michel et al. That pointed out how many people have hump shapes like this. I think it's a little depressing because you may be likely thinking it would be nice to be famous. And you might be famous, but it's inevitable. You will decay away and be forgotten. I don't mean to be depressing. Soviet leaders. I actually showed this in Russia the other day. I was worried a little bit about they've all faded away, all of them. Some of them were long epidemics. Stalin and Lenin are great survivors, and they had a high penetration. But Lenin and Gorbachev, they're beautiful Kermack-McKendrick. I didn't doctor this. They're rapidly being forgotten. So economists don't like this kind of model because it relies on something. Now I'm getting back into economics. This is a Samuelson multiplier accelerator model that tried to explain the same hump-shaped patterns using purely economic things. So he had the growth of consumption or the investment relating to the change in consumption. I won't get into this, but he was able, this is an alternative theory of hump-shaped curves, but it seems to me kind of limited because the other kinds of contagion matter also. Oh, this is economic theories. So some of you are graduate students in economics. You may have heard of these theories. But you know, they've all come and gone. So I'll tell you the secret about economic theory. It's all wrong in the sense that they're only approximations anyway. And it's a matter of taste. Do you like this story that an economist is telling? So these are famous stories. But they're all hump-shaped, and they're all fading away. So now I'm trying to look at business cycle movements and trying to understand what kinds of stories might be behind them. So one thing is the idea about confidence and self-esteem. You've heard this term self-esteem. When raising children, you should try to encourage their self-esteem so they will be confident. Did they talk about that? Actually, I don't have self-esteem up here directly, but confidence is, or business confidence. I think that as the 20th century was different from the 19th century in that we are thinking a lot about confidence, a lot more anyway than they did. So I tried various terms. The one that's most dramatic is this word autosuggestion. You see that there? Do you even know what that means? Maybe not. I'm testing your English, but it's not English. It started out in French. Autosuggestion is really the idea that you have to talk to yourself and boost your self-esteem with your own internal efforts. Émile Coué wrote a book in 1920 that urged you to remember to say this following thing every morning when you get up. I'm quoting Coué and translating him. Every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. Well, keep saying that, and it will boost your self-confidence. For a while, right around 1921, 1922, people really believed that. Apparently, they were all talking about it. And then they turned on it, and it kind of disappeared. But other kinds of things happened, like business confidence. The only thing to fear is fear itself. Or you shouldn't shout fire in a crowded theater. So we developed a government and authorities who tried to boost our self-confidence. So that led us to the 1920s, in which we had great self-confidence, but we had a lot of fraudulent schemes developing. And then there was a reaction. So I'm thinking of the Great Depression as a reaction to all this nonsense about self-confidence. It didn't all happen at the same time in the same place. In Germany, Leni Riefenstahl made a movie in the 1930s called Triumph des Willens, or Triumph of the Will. And it seemed to be saying, maybe you've seen this movie, it was one of the most successful, it was the most successful Nazi propaganda movies. It seemed to be saying, if we Germans all pull together and we just know we can do it, we know we can do it, we can do amazing things. That didn't work out so well, as you may know. This is business confidence. Fear is fear itself. Business confidence was very strong during the Great Depression, or the talk of business confidence. This is another example of a human being, but I plotted him separately. Karl Marx. He is the father of communism. Look at his, now this is from Google Ngram, so it gives the percentage of words in books that are Karl Marx. Now, he was an epidemic. You've heard of this guy, right? The father of communism. He kind of had economic importance, didn't he? Of some sort. He changed people's lives. But let's look at his epidemic curve. Now, he died in the year 1883. So where is that? See, the blue line is Karl Marx. So that's his death, right around there. So he was starting to get famous, but he wasn't that famous. In fact, before that, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, I don't see anything there. You know, he did publish a pamphlet with Engels called the Communist Manifesto. Historians will give you the impression that it was a bestseller. It wasn't. It was ignored by everybody, practically. There were some newspaper articles about these communists, but nobody took them seriously. But look at him just grow. It looks like an epidemic. He didn't peak until the 1970s, which is close to 100 years after his death. So what is it? Now I want to make another comparison with another famous person, the Greek god Zeus. Okay. Now, Zeus has another handicap that Karl Marx didn't have. He never existed. But we see there's an epidemic for Zeus happening around the same time. And in fact, Karl Marx never managed to become as important as Zeus. So what is this? It turns out that there was a classics revival in the 19th century. Why was there a classics revival? Who knows? It's the problem that people in literature departments try to understand. Why are certain novels or songs, well, that would be music, why are these things popular at certain times and not at others? What's so great about Zeus? I don't know. But you had to be there and see the kind of stories that were being spun. I do have another story about Karl Marx that I found from economic historian Mark Skousen. Karl Marx, he claims that Karl Marx was given a gift of the bust of Zeus by a friend who said to Marx, or apparently said to Marx, you know what? You look like Zeus. If you'd only grow your beard out more. And according to Skousen, he grew, you remember that, you can probably have a mental image of this picture of Karl Marx looking fierce with this huge beard. That was the post after he decided he was going to do a Zeus act. Now, I may be dismissing. This seems so outrageous to me that I went to 2 other biographies of Karl Marx, and they both mentioned this bust and the possible influence on Marx. So at least there is a scholarly tradition that maybe Karl Marx was a successful, going viral entrepreneur. Not in his lifetime. The poor guy never realized what change he could make. But it was a success. He invented a brand or an image that made him, as marketing department people will say. This is the most famous photo of Albert Einstein, the physicist. The photographer took the liberty of saying, "Could you stick out your tongue at me?" And there it is, with wild white hair. I put side by side with him Erwin Schrödinger, another physicist of equal caliber. But there's no such, you know what? Einstein was a colorful figure. And he just knew how to ham it up for camera. He also, in his old age, began to look like a prophet or a wise man or a Zeus, maybe. And you can see how much more famous Albert Einstein is to Schrödinger. But I think if you look at their physics, it's hard to tell which. Schrödinger basically invented quantum mechanics. Pretty important stuff. Why is it that we don't talk about him very much? He's a nice-looking guy, right? But he just looks kind of ordinary. Marketers are now getting into neuroscience. Marketers really wonder what makes for a successful ad. They try. Most television ads today are skits with actors. They're like a 30-second movie. And they try to figure out what will get people talking or get people's attention, get them to remember things. But now there's a new field called neuromarketing, which it gets subjects and sets them up with fMRI machines to see their reaction to commercials. And they test commercials out in front of people and look at their reaction in various parts of their brain and are claiming to understand better how to go viral. It's getting to the point where your chances of becoming really famous are, I hate to say it, diminishing, unless you hire a professional marketer who will test market various strategies for you. I'm sounding awfully cynical, but that's the thrust I'm on at the moment. There's a new fields of neuroaesthetics that are again trying to understand contagion of ideas. Google Scholar already gives 2,780 articles using the word neuroaesthetics. There's a book came out recently by Jody Archel and Matthew Jockers that analyzed digitized novels and tried to predict what novel was a success. I don't know if I'm convinced by the research, but if you're thinking of writing a model, This is data analysis. Your heroine, there should be a heroine in the novel. She should be 28 years old. That seems to be the, if you're 28, you're at the most vivid time in your life, apparently, for a love novel. The first love scene should not appear until just after the middle pages of the novel. And there should be a lot of pages involving closeness. Here's another example that talks about brain responses and predicting which articles will be emailed. So here's some neuroscience. Most people don't trade stocks. So you ever thought, I assume most of you don't have a stock portfolio. Ever thought about why not? Or those of you who do, what's different about you? So here's a paper that just came out that I'm not sure, it's not published yet, but I saw it at this conference that I was just at the Society for Neuroscience. They are able to show that people who invest in stocks have a different response of their anterior insula, that's part of the brain, when confronted with riskless choices. So they can figure out by doing a brain scan on you whether you invest in stocks. It's not just your free will or your training. The brain seems to give you subconscious clues as to trajectories. This is Gert Gigerenzer in his book, Gut Feelings. So you may have an instinctual sense of, that shows a person catching a fly ball and using a subconscious brain strategy of keeping the angle of incidence constant as they run forward. And then developing a sort of self-esteem from being able to identify trajectories. This is another study that looked at choices to difficult questions that people were posed while they were in an fMRI machine, or not. The person doesn't give the same answer every time. There's a randomness in the human mind, and people change their appreciation of their own impulses with knowledge of their own randomness. This is Susan Gelman and a psychologist and her term essentialism. The idea is that the human brain makes snap decisions about what is the essential of some event. And these essential qualities are deeply important in the memory structure of the brain. So most of us will think that an original Rembrandt painting is so much more valuable than a copy of a Rembrandt painting. But in fact, they give you the same pleasure if it's a good copy because you can't even tell them apart. So why do you care? This is something in the structure. She's written a book about this, that we naturally attach certain, we store memories in terms of their essential qualities. This is Leon Festinger, the social psychologist, who wrote a classic article in 1954 about social comparison processes. And he argues that stories that are about other people along lines that you compare yourself with them will be contagious. So that means what he said, it may sound obvious or you may say it's obviously wrong. I think it's generally respected as correct, that we spend a lot of time comparing ourselves with other people. You don't compare yourself with really famous people generally, because they're too far away. You compare people who are doing just about as well as you in life, and you're constantly sizing yourself up. So I think this has to do with speculative investing. When there's a bubble in the stock market, when stocks are booming, for example, or home prices are booming, and other people are making money by taking the right side of the trade, it's very attention-getting. Because of the natural tendency toward social comparison processes. So related to that is envy theory. I'm showing here Melanie Klein, who wrote her classic book, Envy and Gratitude, in 1957. or John Dinavagi, who wrote another book here. So envy is a powerful human phenomenon. You're taught that it's wrong, but it's hardwired in your brain. You just don't like the feeling of meeting someone who's doing better than you of. And again, it's a powerful, narratives during strong bull markets tend to be stories that incite feelings of envy. And here's a recent, wow, sorry, I'm going to try not to do that. Here's a recent neuroscience article looking at gratitude and pride, subjecting clients to experiments that give them a feeling that they've achieved something great, or they've achieved something great entirely because somebody else gave them a help. And they're looking at the regions of the brain that are stimulated by these situations that would either produce gratitude or pride. And you see that they're talking about the parietal and lateral prefrontal cortex. But what's interesting to me here is that this is hardwired in your brain. Gratitude is not something that your mother taught you. It's instinctive that when somebody tells you a hint and gives you help, you have this emotional response that's positive and encourages you to behave in a certain way. So theory of mind and mirror neurons. I'm coming. We're going to have questions soon. I'm almost done with this. I'd like to warn you that I hope you'll ask some questions. So Giacomo Rizzolatti found that using monkeys that or macaques, that when another person, even a person, does something like pick up a peanut, the same neurons fire in the monkey's brain that would have fired if the monkey were picking up peanuts. So in some sense, we have a shared experience that may or may not be incited at go viral experiences. Wow, I'm sorry. I'll have to pull it back. Ambiguity aversion, it refers to a discovery attributed to Daniel Ellsberg, that people behave differently, fundamentally differently, in ambiguous situations than in risky situations. We define a risky situation as a situation in which I tell you the probability of success is 0.35 and the probability of failure is 0.65. What do you want to do? That's a risk situation because I've told you the probabilities, and you can maybe do some calculations. Economists assume that that is a good description of people's economic experiences. But Ellsberg said, no, most of the time, people don't know probabilities. So nobody knows what the probability is that the stock market will go up next year. We'd say it's a matter of opinion. So, but economists say, well, then what you do when you reach an ambiguous situation is you make up probabilities in your mind, and then you do calculations with the made-up probabilities. But that isn't. So brain research is showing that ambiguity is dealt with in a different way. You don't substitute probabilities for the ambiguity. You use different parts of the brain. So that's, I'm just concluding then. I think that going viral, as I've said before, of narratives is an important part of economic dynamics, and that we have to try to understand more about what going viral means. We have to use data. I think that we can develop better economic history about understanding why past events occurred if we make efforts to study these things. Now, I have a list of questions for neuroscientists. I don't plan to do any of those research projects that I outline here, but I am writing a book based on my presidential address on neuroeconomics. Because what I want to do is actually look at trying to recreate for various times in history what were the kinds of stories that people were telling. And I probably can never figure out why they went viral. Maybe you get some hint if you read the stories that they were reading. So this is another approach to economic research that I'm recommending. I'll stop there and open this for questions. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And any questions from the audience? Go ahead, please.
Well, I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone for coming to our university. And thank you for the magnificent lecture that you provided us. And I recently read that you don't believe in Bitcoin, but you don't really think it is a bubble. And we've recently seen the market crash from 11,000 to 9,000. And
Oh, I didn't even hear about that. That happened yesterday, or?
yeah, in the last few days. With more youth going into investing without practical or theoretical knowledge, what do you think the outcome of this investment will be? And if this bubble were to burst, how high can the price go before it crashes down?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I may sound different at different times. I'm trying to appreciate Bitcoin and the other cryptocurrencies. One thing, I asked some cryptocurrency expert, how can I study? I need help on understanding these. So he recommended, you can find, I forget the name of the professor at Princeton University. He has an online course on cryptocurrencies, which I recommend. I've been taking the course. I don't remember his name. I wasn't prepared for this course. Do you know the name? Have anyone here taken the Princeton University professor's course on cryptocurrencies? It's online. But then I realized it's interesting. These guys, these computer scientists and cryptography experts are smart people. And they have new ways of doing things that can, like a digital signature, which can identify the signer of a document, and privacy issues are handled in smart ways. And the idea of a blockchain is a subtle, important idea. So I started to take it, but I don't have time. See, that's your problem too, probably, right? You might be, if I could just transfer the knowledge from his course on cryptocurrency, you might accept it. But you're not going to spend a week studying his lectures because you don't have time. So it's only the aficionados who study this, and then they acquire a sort of pride in their success. And they want to emphasize the advantages of cryptocurrencies, maybe prematurely. Once you spend all this time studying it, you want to believe it. But the thing that is really striking to me about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin is it is really viral. I mean, of course, maybe I'm different. It keeps being brought up to me. And I can see it. Maybe, you can judge people's interest. When I'm lecturing to my class at Yale, and then I suddenly mention Bitcoin, there are these subtle cues. The students are waking up at this moment. And this is an exciting topic. It's exactly the question of going viral. So I'd like to compare it. I mentioned the depression of the 1890s. There was no Bitcoin. But you know what? There was something kind of like it. It was called bimetallism. And there were people arguing, this you don't have to, it doesn't sound interesting at all to you. But I can tell you there was a best-selling book in the United States in 1895 called Cohen's Financial School about the advantages of bimetallism. And it was a bestseller. It sold over 1 million copies. That's, back in those days, that was amazing to sell 1 million copies of anything. So I look at Cohen, I'm starting to read it, and you know what? It feels like Bitcoin to me. I can't tell you what it is. We need to analyze it. But it was some monetary esoterica, and it was presented in a colorful way, the way Bitcoin is. So there's something about the Bitcoin story that excites people. The rest of, I hope my talk wasn't boring to you, and I didn't wake you up, or you waked everyone up by talking about Bitcoin. But I think that's what I see in it. It seems to me there might be a rush to judgment that Bitcoin is an important idea as it is now, because Bitcoin is one embodiment of basic ideas in cryptocurrencies. And it doesn't mean that it's the best idea, and it can be changed. there are all kinds of new ones coming. So who says Bitcoin is going to emerge as a winner? That's the classic problem that people make when they invest in new technology. They think, this is a great idea, I'm going to buy shares in it. But yeah, but you're buying shares in the wrong company. This is the one that's going to fail. The great ideas are out there, and somebody is going to figure out how to do it right. You picked the wrong one. They don't tend to understand that, partly because they develop ego involvement, story quality with the... that's why I'm kind of pessimistic about Bitcoin.
Thank you.
More questions?
Yeah, now, who has the mic? It seems to be a game of getting the mic here.
Thank you for exciting lecture. Actually, today on the news, I have heard that some economists have suggested Lithuanian government how to speed up economy in Lithuania, and I thought perhaps it's a professor who is visiting. And the suggestion was to fire thousands of state employees, but later I realized that it was not you who was suggesting that. However, after your lecture and knowing the skepticism of the Lithuanian population, when they think about state employees, I believe this way of saving economy could become viral and
Viable.
well, not viable, but viral and attractive to maybe many of people. And would you think such attempts could help economy,
Right.
like firing many employees, or that would
Okay.
crash, or maybe
So
would not have any influence to the economy?
this is a famous controversy. Should we hire the unemployed in a time of economic weakness? I can trace it back to, it was in the 1890s depression that I just taught you about. You never heard about it. But some local governments in the United States, notably I think Minneapolis decided during the 1890s depression to dig a lake, scoop out a lake in the center of the city. It would be nice to have a lake here. So they hired men with shovels to dig. But this was just at the beginning of power, steam shovels, and they didn't use them. So it was kind of make work, and it was kind of controversial. So the idea has come along ever since that the government should hire the unemployed. But there was always the criticism. You had all those guys out there in Minneapolis digging with shovels. I could have brought in my mechanical power shovel and dug it out in half the time. So it was make work, and it's saddled those efforts ever since. What does the government have to do? So in the Great Depression, they hired a lot of make work to get people jobs. And in some cases, it got the same criticism. On the other hand, it was kind of inspiring because in the United States, they hired people to do things like art and history that would not have been done. I think, after all, and environmental. They were cleaning up the environment. So to some extent, they were able to, that was inspirational, that we were doing things now that are important and new. But it's not totally inspirational. Then there have been proposals that the government should have a list of job projects like that they work on even in normal time, so it's ready to go. Shovel-ready projects, they say. And so Martin Shubik has recently advocated setting up a government agency like that. But we had one in the U.S. in the 1940s. So things have been tried. So what is the bottom line? I think you have a 7% unemployment rate in Lithuania now. You could bring that down to, say, 4%, like would match the U.S., if you only hired 3% of your labor force. Should you do that? Maybe you should. I don't know. I have to think about the project. You would need a national debate on what will these people do. But I don't think it's so inspiring if you have them do make work that isn't producing something. So, okay.
I'm a philologist, and it was very interesting for me, your report. You've mentioned, because you've revealed some common points between economics and linguistics. You've mentioned the play written by Karl Čapek. It is, he saw an awful future for the mankind. How do you see the future? Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I understand. I actually have to read his play. I haven't done that yet. Or maybe I can find it on the internet and watch it. But it does, my understanding, it ends up with the robots ruining the human race. So that was a dramatic ending. So what do I think? Well, I have to say, I think like a finance theorist, there's a risk of that. New technology does carry a risk of loss of employment. So I'm with Norbert Wiener, who is one of the founders of computer science, wrote in his classic book, Cybernetics, in late 1940s, that he was worried then about the future. And he said that he was worried that an ordinary person of ordinary means might not have any employment prospect. And he went around, he made a mission. One of the inventors of the computer went around lecturing that we have to do something about this. So I don't know, it still hasn't happened. We haven't had a catastrophe yet. But I have been advocating that it is a risk. It is a real risk that most countries of the world could be turned into Greece today with a very high unemployment rate. And it could happen because computers have replaced jobs. We don't know. You'll have economists who say it can't happen. There have been people warning of this for centuries and it's never happened. But I don't believe them. I think it's a risk. So what I've argued in my 2003 book, New Financial Order, is that it's important that societies decide on a plan now to deal with this. Something like a universal basic income, or it's not so important that we give it now. It's important that it be ready to be done. We have to also think about what will life be like. What do we want a person of normal abilities to do when there's no job of what we would today call a job? We might rethink our society. Maybe it would be more social duties, playing with children, taking care of lonely people. I don't know what. We haven't figured that out yet, but it should be a subject of conversation now.
Can I? I have a microphone. Hello?
Where are you?
Yeah, here I am. Okay.
Okay, yeah, it's good to stand up. I can't see. I can't see the microphone.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I think I learned a lot about neuroeconomics. I have one question concerning the slides of citation at the beginning, because you cited, for example, authors of Britain and Russia and how often they were cited as percentage. You know what I mean? At the beginning you showed slides of how...
I don't know how I can go back.
And what I remarked is that when I got it right...
which slide?
Not these ones.
Well, I don't know, maybe we can't find it.
No, later. There are percentages of how often authors are cited from Google, not Scholar, but the programs.
Oh,
yeah.
Do you mean this slide?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right.
Later. And what I remarked is that the percentage of how often they cited totally went down. There was the tendency was always that the percentage went down. And
eventually it gets forgotten. Everything.
And actually, my question was the percentage of how often the word robot was cited went down.
Robot. Yes.
Robot. You remember what? Well, maybe.
Yeah. I see if I can find it.
And I wondered especially about how why.
It was up high. Here it is.
Yes. Yes. About why this it should be robot, no? why this is going down, because I consider robots to becoming more important in our today's society. So why is robot?
Because Google Ngrams ends in 2008, and if you, I showed the next slide here, showing a different count. I know it's a little hard to follow, maybe. This is not robots, this is universal basic income. But why would people be talking about universal basic income except for fear of new technology replacing jobs?
But actually it's the same here, because universal basic income, actually I consider it to be very important in today's time, but the graph is going, at least it is not going up.
Well, at the very latest, it's going down. Yeah, I consider that noise, maybe. Things jump around for noisy reasons as well. I don't know. And it may be that it is being forgotten. So I'm thinking that fear of robots lately is reacting to driverless cars, driverless trucks, pilotless ships in the ocean. These are all news that have just come out. Plus, voice-actuated phones in your pocket. You can talk to your phone, and you can get your phone to answer questions. Like, I was impressed. My wife asked her phone, we're going to Bedford High School, but on the way we'd like to stop at a drugstore. And it gave us turn-by-turn instructions to a drugstore on the way to this high school. I was amazed that you can ask something like that. Other people are amazed the same way. Lately, it's been the last few years that you could talk to, and eventually you're going to get into a driverless car and just tell it, take me to such and such a place, and stop at a drugstore along the way. And that, I think, is bringing back fear. Now, it could be that nothing like that will happen. Suddenly it will go quiet again, and people will start forgetting and get complacent again. I don't know.
Thank you for being here. It is a pleasure to learn from you. My question is, it's working? Okay. My question is, how do you imagine a perfect economy in the global context?
Which economy?
How do you imagine a perfect economy in the global context, in the terms of market cycles, international trade, and so on? Where is the balance?
Well, I don't know. I'm hoping that we don't have a disastrous economy. And I don't know about the perfect economy. One thing is globalization. I think this is a problem. That one thing that's happening now around the world is a cosmopolitan class is developing as a separate. David Hartman, who is a philosopher, talks about the world being divided into what he calls any places and some places. So any places are people who they've lost contact with their home of origin. They're today in London and tomorrow in Beijing. They all speak English, which is the new lingua franca. And then the some places are people who live in a rural area or a town somewhere that they don't travel around the world and they don't speak English. This division goes back even further. It was first really prominently made by the sociologist Robert Merton in the 1940s, that he could see society dividing into these two groups. He called them cosmopolitans and locals. And Merton gave a simple test. He interviewed people, and he said that he went to a town, Revere, Massachusetts, which he picked, and interviewed everyone in the town, a little town. And he found there were two kinds. This is what he got as a conclusion from interviewing. Some of those people in this little town didn't feel like they lived in that little town. They read international newspapers and they identified themselves with the world. The simple question that he would ask to find out which one we were, the question was, are the people in this town nice? Do you like the people here? And the locals would then have a lot to say. They would say, this is a wonderful town. People are, and they would give examples of people caring about each other. When you ask a cosmopolitan, the answer is, oh yeah, it's a nice town. And they can't think of anything to say about it. So that's a big trend happening in the world today. And I think it's troublesome because what's going to happen there will be conflict. I see it happening in the United States today. Our President Trump, whom I haven't managed not to mention until now, he represents some places, the people that live in this little town you've never heard of. And it's not so much that they're unemployed, but they feel unappreciated and resent. That also explains Brexit. London looked like filled with, if you've ever been there, you see so many people, look at they're from everywhere. I went to a meeting at a bank with my publicist for my book. I was on a book tour. And I went to it was Bank of England, maybe? I'm trying to remember. But after we went out, she said, my British publicist, she said, you know, there wasn't a single Brit in the room. Everyone, she figured out, was from a foreign country. So here you have London, which looks so successful, rich, successful, but they don't look British. And so that's why we have, it's a natural conflict, which David Hartman is explaining, but I think others are into this too. We have to somehow remember those someplace people.
You mentioned this starting to be a famous concept of universal basic income. So my question is, what do you think about the now becoming more famous suggestions of having these?
I'm sorry, what do I think about?
About the proposals of introducing these universal basic income to various economies.
Yeah, well, I've been interested in basic income for a long time. So Juliet Reese Williams wrote a book on it in the 1940s, and it's a nice little book. But the book that is most interesting to me is Robert Theobald's 1963, I think, book called Free Men and Free Markets, advocating basic income. And in that book, the strongest thing that comes through is that he has faith that we people will figure out something meaningful for people who are replaced by machines. And he said we shouldn't try to keep them working as they used to. He said, you remember that a lot of work that used to be done wasn't very meaningful. Do you really want to send someone to work every day to sit at a conveyor belt and do the same thing again and again? What's good about that? And he said, I have reason to optimism about human nature, that if people have nothing to do, they won't, this is what he said, he might dispute this, they won't turn into total ingrates. They will find something humanly useful and it's something good to do. So I'll give you one other example that may suggest that Theobald might have been right. Since the beginning of the 20th century, most countries in the world have developed old age pensions. And so people who are perfectly healthy, when they reach a magic retirement age, retire, and they have a universal basic income offered. So what do you think of them, these people? You've met some of them. Were they selfishly ingrating? Well, some of them are selfish, but some of them become great grandparents, or they take up volunteer causes. And maybe it's okay, right? We're just going to move the retirement age continually downward, and you'll end up with mandatory work until you reach the age of 25, and then you're on retirement. You've done your work. So maybe that is a model for what universal basic income will look like. On the other hand, maybe we should also make the universal basic income not quite free. That there's some judge of your being a worthy citizen. So taking care of your grandchildren would qualify as maybe. But I haven't really thought these things through. I'm saying we as a society should be thinking these things through now. And I suspect it won't be so bad if we do a good job of rethinking our society after the fourth industrial revolution.
when you mentioned Star Wars, I thought about a little bit back about the film industry and what it was promoting.
The film industry?
Yeah. I mean, back to films like Back to the Future or Star Wars or Planet of Apes, it looks like they try to show the future in some way which the humans want to develop or what's interesting for them. But if we look at the film industry of today, it's more or less films of action. And they do not show artificial intelligence or Alexa or Siri or autonomous driving. What do you think? Does it mean that this innovation is bringing boredom, and what they want to promote is some action?
I was recently on a transatlantic flight and looking at in the business class section, and everyone has their own TV screen. Usually they're traveling alone, and they pick their own TV show or their own movie. And I walked up and down the aisle just to get a sense of what people were watching. And what struck me is that the men were overwhelmingly watching violent battles, and the women were mostly watching women arguing with each other, and so with no violence. And then I looked at the story. There's a primordial story that it's always a story about one soldier or one policeman taking abnormally high risks and heroism and impossibly difficult situations. So it centers on the action of one person who is showing great courage or something. It's a hero. That's why I showed that Stravinsky thing earlier. I'm not unaffected by these myself, but I've gotten to the point where I'm not going to watch a violent action movie on an airplane. I'm not going to do that. But it does reflect something about story. So maybe it's all right, though, to watch those. It's because you're not hurting anyone. It's just all imaginary. I don't know that it makes us militaristic. Maybe it has the opposite effect. It can all be vicarious.
Hey, thank you for a great talk. I was wondering, how can we use storytelling when coming to avoid the next financial crisis? How can we use storytelling when we're trying to avoid the next financial crisis? Because looking at 2008, there was a huge narrative happening, and even though there were red flags, there was nobody who was willing to listen, even though there were people who were trying to speak out.
Well, it's interesting you pick up 2008, let me go back to 2007. I think that our world leaders showed an intuitive appreciation of narrative economics. See, what I'm saying is kind of obvious in a way that these stories matter. It's just that economists don't want to make this their specialty. That would be the journalism department or something else. What happened in 2007 was, that I've noted, is in Britain, there was a bank called Northern Rock, which couldn't pay out, or was rumored to be shortly about to fail. And so newspaper reporters in Britain went to Northern Rock bank outlets, and they found lines of people crowding around the bank, and interviewed them, and they said, yeah, we heard that the Northern Rock Bank is about to fail, so we're getting our money out. And these were printed in newspapers. Now, a little bit of UK history. They had deposit insurance on banks, but it only went up, I think it was £7,500. So you had people who put their life savings planning for retirement, and they might have had £200,000 or £300,000 in the bank. And they suddenly panicked, thinking they could lose all of that. So the narrative started spreading, and people started remembering stories. Britain had not had a bank run since 1866. So what happened was Mervyn King, who was the governor of the Bank of England, and Alastair Dowling, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, made public statement that we are bailing out Northern Rock completely. Doesn't matter what size deposit you have. They did that to stop the narrative. I had lunch with Mervyn King recently, he doesn't deny, I don't want to quote him, but it was a narrative story that these people had the good sense to realize we don't want to let bank run stories proliferate now. Then the same thing happened in the US in 2008 with Henry Paulson, who was Treasury Secretary, and Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve, when the Prime Reserve Fund was about to go bankrupt. Well, it was going to break the buck, as they said. And they then immediately put on a guarantee to stop that. Both of these were examples where people, despite their PhD training in economics, realized that we don't want to let that narrative get started. That's really important, because once something that involves lack of trust or fear of something that we've been not worrying about, once it gets started, it can go viral. And then you have to nip it in the bud. So this is a basic lesson in economics. You have to be listening to narratives. Read the paper, listen to the radio. This is what Donald J. Trump is terrific at, is listening to narratives and refashioning them. Let's hope to good purpose.
Yeah, thank you. So, more questions?
Yeah.
Go.
I would like to go back a little bit to the basic income theme. We hear a lot about the benefits of the basic income system, but what pitfalls, danger of the basic income you would highlight? Because people that are mentioning that the danger of getting stuck into the political systems that supports basic income, maybe the inflation, what else?
Right.
Thank you.
Well, there was a Swiss referendum about a year ago for a basic income in Switzerland. And I think the Swiss are high-minded people, but they voted it down. They voted it down because the framers of the basic income proposal thought, well, what should the basic income be for a family? What do you need to live a normal life in Switzerland? And I thought it was something like, does anyone remember, like 25,000 euros a year? Well, they don't have euros, but I'm translating it. And then they figured out what the tax bill would be on people who work. And they didn't like it. They didn't want to pay for that. There would be a lot of people getting this basic income. So it's a problem. So there is people who oppose basic income, and you may have heard from them from Switzerland, talk about the possibility that we'll lose the work ethic. If you don't have to work, the basic income emphasizes that you shouldn't have to work at all. You don't have to prove your worth. And the problem is that you could develop a class of people who lose the idea that they have to contribute at all. And maybe they would take drugs, or worse yet, they would play computer games all day. And maybe there would be subtle changes in our society where we lose our sense of social cohesiveness. So I'm not advocating clearly basic. I'm thinking that we need to think about it. And this requires research and study. There are basic income experiments that have been undertaken. I'm not sure that these experiments resolve the issue, but we need to think about these things, because I suspect that we will, in the next few decades, be faced, I'm not saying we will, but I suspect we'll be faced with a real problem.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. Go ahead, please.
If you don't mind, I would like to refer to the first question about cryptocurrencies, because Bitcoin is being widely discussed in use. However, there are other coins popular by market capitalization going by. And the question is, what do you think about cryptocurrency industry as the new economic paradigm? And what do you think about the fact that during next 2 months, the first index of cryptocurrency will be introduced to exchange, just similar like S&P 500. So what do you think about this? And would you invest money in this, movement?
Well, I haven't invested money in Bitcoin, I have to say. So we're now getting an index. I hadn't heard this news. An index of Bitcoin prices, of cryptocurrency prices.
Of top 20 of them, and the index is based on Markowitz portfolio diversification theory.
In other words, they're going to be selling this index. You can invest in an index.
You can invest in an index, so they're
that's clever.
Making rebalancing of investments every week. So the coins are being changed from, less popular.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this?
I'm not going to endorse any investments on the on the fly like this, but it's going to be hard to do the variance-covariance matrix of these products that are just emerging, so it might not be stable. But that might be the minor consideration. It's interesting they move so fast to build an index of them. There's changes happening in the investing world. We're becoming much more indexed. There's also a rise in so-called passive indexing. That's sort of what this is, but it's in a certain product level. Indexing wasn't a big thing until after the Great Depression or during the Great Depression. So it took centuries for the first stock market indexes to get attention. But now Bitcoin immediately produces them, almost immediately. I was impressed with the news the other day that the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is going to open up a futures market for Bitcoin. I have connections with CME, and I express my doubts about this. Why do we need a futures market so fast in this thing? It's not really a thing. It has value, maybe. I don't mean to dismiss it. It might have value because of things that are a little bit very hard to measure. It might be considered a medium of exchange that people like better, like credit cards replace. Most of you don't spend money anymore, right? So maybe it will become important. But then again, why not one of the other currencies? There's hundreds of them. And maybe the one that's going to prevail hasn't been started yet. So this is what we call a fundamental uncertainty or ambiguity. You can invest in it, but nobody can tell you whether it's right or wrong. And I'm more interested in studying the social reaction to these things than trying to figure out just what is their long run advantage.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we have the time for the last question, please.
So thank you very much for the amazing lecture and for your visit. And I'd like to ask, what is your narrative on the Lithuanian economy? And
of the Lithuanian economy?
Yeah, and what do you think are the key areas we should focus on to keep it stable and growing?
Well, my narrative of the Lithuanian economy that I had when I was growing up was centered on Barbara Radvilaitė, who we thought was our ancestor. But it turns out she can't be our direct ancestor because she did not have any surviving children. Okay, so she's our relative. So that was our story. My mother had a beautiful picture of her. It was a nice story for us because we thought we were her relative. But that's my story of some of my relatives back in Michigan. They still have that story of Lithuania. There was a nice Polish movie about Barbara Radvilaitė. Do you know this movie? Some of you with me. Called An Epitaph for Barbara Radvilaitė, or however they put it in Polish. But now my story is changed. But I'm not typical of American. I just got a tour of the scientific laboratories at Vilnius University just minutes ago. So my narrative has changed totally into cutting-edge scientific research. You have to get that message across. It is impressive what's going on here. So the other thing, what else can I say about? I once asked a taxi driver, a black taxi driver. I was going to Lithuania. I said, ever heard of Lithuania? And he said, of course. But it was something about basketball, I think. And then I said, do you know where it is? Of course, he had no idea where it is. So, but I think there's a possibility of getting a real message through. That Lithuania is well, it's a little bit like Ireland seems to have more of a, we see ads for, do you advertise in the U.S.? I mean, there are ads about the Celtic tiger. I'm just thinking from memory that I've seen in the U.S. And they show a photograph of several bright, young, intelligent-looking young people saying, this is the Ireland of today. Now, I'm starting to sound like a marketing I'm not a marketing person, but you asked me the question. So you have to get the message out. But I assume that Lithuania is doing something like that.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, all right. I just don't remember seeing an ad for Lithuania ever in the United States, but I missed them maybe.
We advertise in Europe. Basically, in Europe, we had some ads, directly.
Yeah. I hate to advocate. You had just asked me this. People ask me questions and I get in trouble by advocating things that come to mind momentarily.
So thank you very much. And I thank Professor Shiller and the beautiful and nice audience for such a nice lecture. Let's thank Professor once again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm from an interdisciplinary faculty.
Uh-huh.
Economics, information technologies, and linguistics. My former dean has found some vulnerable points, or probably points for development in the part of your theory concerning bubble.